Hello, welcome everybody. Hope you're doing all right, staying safe and not too bored. Here is section 3, Radical Days of the Revolution. All right, the monarchy is abolished. In 1793, the revolution entered a radical phase. For a year, France experienced one of the bloodiest regimes in its long history as determined leaders sought to extend and preserve the revolution. So the monarchy is abolished at this point. So we're picking up from where we had been not last week, that was spring break, the week prior. So as the revolution continued, dismal news about the war abroad heightened tensions. Well-trained Prussian forces were cutting down raw French recruits. In addition, royalist officers are deserting the French army, joining the émigrés, the émigrés are the nobles that escaped France and are off in other countries, kind of spreading rumors about how terrible France is at this time. So those royalist officers high up in the military have left, and now it's just kind of the peasants who are in the military, and they're pretty much getting crushed by the Prussians. Others are hoping to restore the king's power. Tensions are quickly leading to violence. So battle disasters quickly inflamed revolutionaries who thought the king was in league with the enemies. On August 10th, 1792, a crowd of Parisians, people living in Paris, stormed the royal palace, where the king and his family are staying, and they slaughtered the king's guards. The royal family then fled to the Legislative Assembly, escaping before the mob actually arrived. About a month later, citizens attacked prisons that held nobles and priests accused of political offenses. At this point, about 1,200 prisoners are killed, and many of them are just regular criminals, have nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with the nobles or the priests or the first or second estates. Radicals take over and execute the king. Backed by Paris crowds, radicals then took control of the assembly. They called for an election of a new legislative bodies. Remember, legislative means that they are making the laws. So this would be sort of like our Congress, our House of Representatives in our state, or Senate. And they call this the National Convention. So this is who would be putting out the rights of man and the citizen, which is, we had analyzed that previously. So suffrage, the right to vote, was to be extended to all male citizens, not just property owners. So it's still just males, but now you don't have to own property. So you can be renting or living on someone else's land, but if you are a man and you are over the age of 18, you could vote in France. The convention that met in 1792 in September was a much more radical body than earlier assemblies. And remember, what I mean by radical is they're wanting more changes, more significant changes. It voted to abolish the monarchy and to instead put in place a republic, which they called the French Republic. Deputies then drew up a new constitution for France. The Jacobins, who controlled the convention, set out to erase all traces of the old order. So they want it to be a completely different France, nothing like the Estates General. They seized the lands of nobles and abolished titles of nobility. So there was no more lord or ladies. During the early months of the Republic, the convention also put Louis XVI on trial as a traitor to France. And the king was convicted by a single vote, so one more vote, and sentenced to death. And it says 1793, January, Louis mounts the scaffold in a public square in Paris. And you can see the picture here of Louis XVI mounting the scaffold. Moments later, the king is beheaded. And he was beheaded by the guillotine, which we will talk about in just a moment. The executioner actually lifted the king's head by the hair and held it in front of the crowd, which people were cheering for. In October, Marie Antoinette was also executed. So if we go back, you'll see The king was executed in January, and it's not until October that Marie Antoinette is also executed. So she lives it's pretty significantly longer than her husband does, a whole 10 months. But she pretty much knew that it was coming. And the popular press celebrated her death. The queen, however, showed great dignity as she went to her death. And typically, we would read some primary sources explaining the trial and the killing of both Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI from somebody who was obviously a friend or an admirer of Marie Antoinette, and then from somebody who absolutely hated her, and how those accounts really differ. But what's agreed upon is that she didn't try and run away. She faced her trial and her eventual execution with pretty significant dignity. I mean, didn't really cry, just kind of took it head on and accepted it, which is pretty significant. And here's a picture of Louis XVI's head being shown to the crowd. See, right there. All right, so the convention creates a new committee to deal with the threats to France. The convention created the Committee of Public Safety, which we will soon find is a pretty hypocritical name. So this is a member of 12 people, or a committee of 12 people, and they have almost absolute power to save the revolution. The committee prepared France for all-out war, issuing a levée en masse, or mass levée, which would be a tax. So everybody is getting taxed. It's requiring all citizens to contribute to this war effort. In addition, the 12 members of the committee were in charge of trials and execution, and that is crucial in these upcoming months and years. Spurred by revolutionary fervor, French recruits marched off to defend the Republic. Young officers developed effective new tactics to win battles with masses of ill-trained but patriotic forces. Soon, French armies overran the Netherlands, then invaded Italy, and then at home they crushed peasant revolts. European monarchs shuddered as the revolutionaries carried freedom fever into conquered lands, right? The monarchs are against this. Remember that French plague that they were talking about and making comments about? So this is even more intense of, if France is accomplishing this, ruling themselves without a monarch, it's fine in America because they're so far away and it's not within the same continent. And they still are honestly being pretty prejudiced to the Americans and thinking, they're colonists, they're the misfits, they're the people that were sent away. And it's not a constant reminder of these people can control themselves. France is. It would be the difference of somebody in another town versus your neighbor, right? You're going to be a little bit more concerned about that. So these monarchs are getting a bit frightened, you could say. Okay, so this is when we meet Robespierre, who was a very pivotal figure in the French Revolution, especially in the Reign of Terror. So Robespierre, he's called the incorruptible. So he cannot be corrupted, is what is believed. That's his nickname. At home, the government battled counter-revolutionaries under the guiding hand of Maximilien Robespierre. He was a lawyer and a politician, and he quickly rose to be the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. He promoted religious toleration, so being tolerant of all religions, and wanted to abolish slavery. So those are the things that he is standing for at the beginning of his career, you could say. The guillotine defines the Reign of Terror. Robespierre was one of the chief architects of the Reign of Terror, so he's mainly the guy that's kind of leading what we now call the Reign of Terror. He's kind of the guy responsible for it. This lasted from September 1793 to July 1794, and people in France were arrested for not supporting the revolution, and many were executed. Revolutionary courts conducted hasty trials Spectators greeted death sentences with cries of "Hail the Republic" or "Death to the traitors." So these are people that are just scared of people who are going against the revolution, and also kind of full of hate, right? They want this revolution. They don't want to go back to the monarchy. They want to make all these changes, and they are not in agreement with people who don't want these changes. They don't want to stay how they are. Even though the changes have been made, they want even more. Suspect were those who resisted the revolution, so about 300,000 people were arrested during the Reign of Terror. 17,000 to 40,000 people, we don't know exactly, were executed. So up to 40,000 people were executed during this. Very quick, it's not, again, we can go back, it's a year, less than a year actually, September to July. 40,000 people were executed in just that very short amount of time. So you can see why it's called the Reign of Terror. Many were victims of mistaken identity or were falsely accused by their neighbors. So this kind of turns into a witch hunt. You can report somebody and say that they are against the revolution, and really, regardless of what they say, they're probably going to get at least arrested, potentially executed. Many more were packed into hideous prisons where deaths from disease were common. So even if you were just arrested on potentially false charges, there wasn't much investigation. You were just arrested. You were considered a threat, and most people died in prisons. But if they had evidence on you, then they could execute you pretty easily, and with a scary amount of public support. Okay. The engine of the terror was the guillotine, which I know many of you are aware of. And as soon as we started talking about the French Revolution, we're asking when the guillotine comes in. This is when it comes in. This device was used during the Reign of Terror to execute thousands by beheading. Its fast-falling blade extinguished life instantly, or so they thought. A member of the legislature, Dr. Joseph Guillotine, had introduced it as a more humane method of beheading than the uncertain axe. So what that means is, previous to the guillotine, obviously you would just have an executioner who would, take an axe, and that's how they would behead somebody, chop the neck. With the guillotine, they believed that it was more humane. So it was faster, it was quicker, it was more efficient, and then also a bit more humane for the actual executioner themselves. So they didn't necessarily have to swing that axe. They could just pull the rope that's on the side here. This would come crashing down, and then they could move along. So that's why they really used this guillotine and upheld it. Most executions occurred in towns that had openly rebelled against the convention, for obvious reasons, right? They're saying that they would be against change, and if you're against change, you're against the revolution, and therefore you are a threat and you need to be eliminated. That's the thinking during the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary armies were set up to bring rebellious cities under the control of the convention. And guillotining, like I had mentioned, it's pretty fast, it's pretty efficient, but sometimes there was a long line of people that they needed to get through. So when guillotining proved too slow, the condemned were shot with a cluster of small iron balls into open graves. So it's getting pretty scary in France during this time. The Committee of Public Safety held that all of this bloodletting is only temporary. So they say we have to get through this part first, and then we'll get into their plans for what they think comes after all of this. So they say this is necessary in order for us to have this great society once we emerge from this terror-filled time. Also, this shows the percentage of the victims of the terror by class. So again, this is supposed to be the enemies of the revolution, but you can see 82% of the victims of this time period that are being executed are peasants and the bourgeoisie. 8% are from the first class, the clergy, and then 10% are from the second estate. So that is a little bit troubling as well. Obviously, we know because of the population breakdown that about 90% of the population, if not more, is from this third estate, but still, this is significantly, you would think it would be at least a little bit more representative of the second and first estate if it's truly supposed to be getting rid of the threat to the revolution. When the war and domestic crisis were over, this is what the Committee of Public Safety promised: the true, quote unquote, republic of virtue would follow. So this is what they think society is going to be after this reign of terror. Again, this is a necessary part. They're telling people we have to get rid of the people who are against the revolution, and then we will have this republic of virtue. So remember the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. We had read that and done some analysis of it. They are not following that at this point in time because, again, they believe that that will come after. So first they're getting through the Reign of Terror, and then they will follow the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. The Committee of Public Safety also took steps to control and shape a French society. Robespierre called this new order the Republic of Virtue, a democratic republic composed of good citizens. The only way that we can make this society composed of good citizens is to get rid of the quote-unquote bad citizens, right? The people against the revolution. As outward signs of support for the Republic, the titles of citizen and citizeness would replace Mr. and Madame. So remember, there's Madame, Mademoiselle, and Monsieur, which would be Mr. in French. Those are no more. Those are old titles of the old ways, and so they're going to switch to the titles of you are either citizen or citizeness. So I would be citizeness Quigley. Women would wear long dresses inspired by clothing in the ancient Roman Republic. And again, these are all, they did some of these things, but not all of them completely caught on. So there is definitely some women that are wearing these long dresses, but it's by no means like an enforced dress code. This is kind of Robespierre ideal society. He says that good citizens would be formed by good education. Good education is a pretty vague terminology, so one step that he took in order to provide that good education was law aimed at primary education. So primary would be like elementary school, maybe middle school. A law aimed at primary education for all was passed but not widely implemented. So basically, that everybody could attend at least elementary school is what Robespierre had envisioned. But most people did not do that, whether they couldn't actually send their kids to school because they needed them to work, or there wasn't a teacher, or there wasn't even a school in their town. And also with all of this terror going on, there's bigger fish to fry, you could say. Another law abolished slavery in French colonies. Saint-Dominique, which we now call Haiti, was actually a colony of France's, and they themselves had their own revolution at the same time that France is having their revolution, and against slavery more specifically, and then also just against French rule. The French stay in charge, but they do abolish slavery in the colonies. Because people were alarmed about high inflation, so that was that whole bread analogy that I had been talking about and giving you guys a couple of times, of where the bread used to cost $5 and now all of a sudden it costs $20, so their money has less worth, less buying power. So people are obviously rightfully alarmed about that. They're worried. The committee tries to control the prices of essential goods such as fuel, food, and clothing. The control, however, did not work well because the government had no way to enforce them. So they can put out a law that says bread has to be $5, But if you have no system of backing up and making sure that the bakers are selling them for $5, it's really not going to do much good. So they didn't have any way to enforce it. So you can pass all the laws you want, but if there's no one making sure that people are abiding by these laws, they're kind of pointless. And that's what's going on during this time. The convention also pursued a policy of de-Christianization, which is interesting because initially Robespierre kind of got into this position because he preached that he was tolerant of religions. And now, a couple months or year into this reign of terror, it comes out that the convention, and remember the Committee of Public Safety is a part of the convention. They come out with policies that are of de-Christianization, so against Christianity or the religion of Christianity. The reason for that is because they believed that Christianity encouraged superstition rather than the use of reason. So what I mean by that, or what they would mean by that, is that you could potentially say that something was caused by God or Jesus or potentially a saint, and this convention is saying that that's bad because then that takes away the use of reasoning and logic, and they are all for reasoning and logic. So they don't want people to rely on forces that are outside themselves. They want people to be reasonable and logical and think through it themselves and not rely upon these religions. They go so far as to remove the word saint from the street names. Churches are looted, so all of their valuables are taken out, and then they are closed down by revolutionary armies. And priests are actually encouraged to marry. And remember, in Catholicism, priests are not allowed to get married or have any relations. So they are making some pretty significant changes here. In Paris, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which hopefully we know it caught on fire last year. This was the center of the Catholic religion in France, and France during this time period is pretty devoutly Catholic. It was designated a temple of reason. So they kept the Notre Dame intact, and a lot of people find that very impressive that the Notre Dame Cathedral stayed throughout the French Revolution because of how intensely anti-religious the French Revolution became at certain points. But they kept it intact, and probably just because, I mean, this is medieval structure and it's pretty beautiful architecture and it's massive. So they kept it intact, but it was no longer called a cathedral or the Notre Dame. It was now called a temple of reason. Again, all about that reasoning and that logic. Also, a new calendar is adopted, which is pretty insane. So they do away with our calendar. There's no more like March. There's no more April. And they also, years are no longer numbered from the birth of Jesus, but rather from the date September 22nd, 1792. So that becomes day one. So 1792 becomes year one. 1793 would be year two. So on and so forth. And the reason they chose 1722, 1792 is because they consider that to be the first day of the Republic. So they are completely starting fresh. The calendar had 12 months, so similar to ours, and then it kind of goes off the rails. So it's 12 months, but it consists of 3 10-day long weeks. So no more 7-day long weeks with, Monday through Sunday. It's now 10-day long weeks, and there's 3 of them. So there's going to be 30 days in every month. And the 10th day of every week is going to be a day of rest. The main reason why they made it so new and kind of confusing is because they wanted to delete any race Sunday. Sunday is obviously of religious significance, so they wanted to make it impossible for anyone to figure out what is actually Sunday, what day would be Sunday. because they wanted to make sure that nobody would be holding worship services on Sunday, and nobody would be celebrating church holidays on these Sundays. So they purposefully made it confusing so that you couldn't figure out what actual day it was, for the reason of they didn't want anybody to be holding these like maybe underground church ceremonies or services, and they definitely didn't want anybody celebrating church holidays, so things like Easter or Christmas they did not want to be celebrated. And again, goes back to the reasoning and the logic. They don't want people to be encouraged into superstition as they would have seen religion. So here is that new Republican calendar. You can see the meaning of their months are rather naturally inspired, so inspired by nature. You've got vintage, fog, frost, snow, rain, wind, budding, flowers, meadow, harvest, heat, and fruit, and they all kind of align with the year or the month, the season that they would be taking place in. So like budding, when the flowers would be budding and just starting to bloom, is where we are now. So March 21st to April 19th. And then once you got to April 20th to May 19th, that would be the flowers. So that would be full spring. And then you've got early summer here with meadow. You've got the first harvest of summer with June and July. Then you've got heat with July through August 17th. And then fruit, August to September. September 22nd, remember that's their first day. That's when their calendar starts anew. So that would be like their New Year's. September 22nd, 1792, year one. So that's vintage, and then you've got fog and then frost, and it'll kind of make sense with the names. And again, it's purposefully trying to be confusing. Okay, in less than a year, the new French government had raised a huge army. By September 1794, it had more than 1 million soldiers. It's the largest army that was ever seen in Europe, and it easily pushed the invaders from other countries back across the Rhine River. So this new French army was created by the people's government, right? That's what the French Revolution has brought at this point. The monarchy has been executed, and now it is being run by the convention, the government for the people, by the people. And its wars are therefore also the people's wars. So they're no longer having to fight for their specific nobles or for their noble causes, which we've seen previously in world history. Think about the Elizabeth movie with her war against the Spanish Armada. That was all personally involved, right? It was because Elizabeth did something and Philip II of Spain did something. This is no longer the case. It is now the people who are fighting for something that they want. They are choosing to fight. And that's a really powerful thing. By summer of 1794, the French had largely defeated their foreign foes, and there was an obvious lesser need for the Reign of Terror. However, it continued. And it becomes obvious at this point that Robespierre, who's pictured here, was obsessed with ridding France of all corrupt elements, and many in the National Convention who feared Robespierre decided to act in case that they might be the next victims, right? So they start the gears and kind of shutting the public of safety, the Committee of Public Safety down, because they don't want to be executed. And it's looking like it might get to that point. Within a year, the terror consumed those who initiated it. Weary of bloodshed and fearing for their own lives, members of the convention turned on the Committee of Public Safety. On the night of July 27th, 1794, Robespierre was arrested, and the next day he was executed at the heads. After the heads of Robespierre and other radicals fell, executions slowed dramatically. And I have attached a video here, which I will just attach to Google Classroom, and I would highly encourage you to watch it. It goes a little bit more in depth about Robespierre. He is a very, very interesting character. He went so far as to have a holiday for himself where he claimed that he was like supreme emperor or something like that. And he came out in a white toga, and he climbed a mountain of I think it was like white paper. It was wood, but it was covered in white paper, and he said that he was divine. And I mean, he clearly got drunk on power. He's very interesting, to say the least. He also, at the time when they arrested him, he was aware that he was going to be arrested. So he locked himself in a room. He attempted suicide, but was unsuccessful and actually shot off his jaw. So his jaw was dangling off of his face. They wrapped him up. Then they went to go take him to get executed. And moments before they actually executed him, pulled the rope on the guillotine, they took off his bandage, and they could hear his agonizing screams. So he had a very untimely end. But again, he is the architect. He is the guy that started and maintained this reign of terror. So did he have it coming? Maybe. All right, so please check out that video. It's very interesting. I think it's a bit shorter. And then the other stuff that we are doing this week will be posted on Google Classroom. So I will be posting weekly update slides that will tell you when everything is what I expect you to do for the week, and when it's all due. So everything from here on out will be due Fridays at midnight. So if you turn them in early, that's great. But if for whatever reason you can't turn it in until midnight on Friday, that's still fine. That is the absolute last that I will take it. If you have anything else that you haven't been able to do, please get that done as soon as possible. And always, you can email me or remind.